Good day and welcome to H638. We are presently in Torrekulla in the commune of Mölndal, and it's a lovely day. It's a little bit chilly and therefore we have a fog surrounding us, but there is no wind, which is on the positive side. Today I will talk about why words and objects are the same. Yes, it's Wittgenstein's private language argument. One of the most known philosophical queries ever in the philosophical history. Nothing has been more debated, and I had the privilege actually to debate it with Saul Kripke once, many years ago. And Kripke is one of the most famous translators of the thought of Wittgenstein. So he tried to help people to understand this query. And I think this goes to show how difficult it can be to grasp. One of the reasons it's very hard to grasp, it's not presented in any way similar to other philosophical problems. It doesn't have stringency, it's not linear, because the argument that Wittgenstein wants to do is completely different from what we find ordinary in philosophy. But without destroying anything about the understanding, I can simply just state that the problem has to do with how rules, and especially the word meaning, can lure us to believing in a private language underneath ordinary language. And here it's very important to say lure. Lure. Trick. Lure.
Lure.
Lure. Lure is an important word here because we are lured. It does not have to be that way. It's not like the word meaning does these things. We can get tricked, we can get deceived, and the illusion we are actually making ourselves in a way. And I think that could be the problem of Saul Kripke's interpretation. He thinks it's a necessary problem that comes from language, but it's rather alluring. It's an illusion of some sort. And we do it ourselves. Remembering that as some sort of thing to keep in your head will help you to understand the Wittgensteinian private language argument. So don't forget that. It's very, very important. What you can say, rules, meaning, and a lot of other words are on an equal level in language. One cannot, or one is not allowed to ask what all words in the language mean. It doesn't take precedence. The word is not of a higher importance in an abstract sense than any other word. You can still use it. You can ask a friend, what do you mean by that? Or what does the word table mean in Greek? Like we said the other day, it's called trapeza. Those things are allowed. What's not allowed is to think that the word meaning is on a different level altogether, somewhere outside language. And where is outside language? It's inside ourselves. That's the private language. Could, if you study linguistics or read the work of Austin, also be called intention. The problem goes from paragraph 243 to 315, roughly. and it's been dubbed the private language argument afterwards. Posthumously, after Wittgenstein passed away, the book Philosophical Investigations were published. And you can say this instead. Suppose a person is stranded on a deserted island and has managed to bring along a diary. One day he decides, maybe in order to keep himself sane, to begin recording a mark, S for instance, in his diary whenever he experiences a certain sensation. Whenever the sensation occurs, he focuses his attention upon it. In effect, he tries mentally to point to it and marks S. Wittgenstein's conclusion is that it's not possible to meaningfully use a term to refer to private mental state in this way. Thus, there can be no private language. Wittgenstein's complaint is, in the present case, that is, the speaker has no criterion of correctness, and that's the important thing. There are no rules to tell the speaker himself whenever he's using the term S in a correct way. And you can almost say that there are not rules in a more higher level in language. What we've done after we've been investigating language is to construct rules. But those rules is not what caused language. I think that's very easy to understand, because first came language and later came rules. How could it in that case be possible for the rules to rule the language? It's not possible. That's one historical way of thinking about it. And I think we form a term, this method, calling the etymological method. It could work in some case, and it's always helpful. But Wittgenstein shows another aspect of this problem. He tries to show us by opening up our thinking, I could say, making it less limited, because this is a limitation of what language is. Almost in the same way that rules could pose limitations to language. Those limitations are obviously outside language. So what does these rules do? Well, if they're outside a language, they can't do anything good, because they're not in the language game. Therefore, they can only cause disturbance. When you try to apply rules to language, you will disturb your language sense. They are external. And see the rules as something that we constructed. You could also say that they come from an extension of the word meaning. They are a helping tool, and they should be looked upon being inside of language. Almost to answer a question, could you help me? I don't understand. That's the correct use of the word meaning. I will state another paragraph, 272. And this is not so clearly stated, which could actually be helpful. The essential thing about private experience is really not that each person possesses his own example, but that nobody knows whatever people have this or something else. The assumption would thus be possible though unbelievable, that one section of mankind had one sensation of red and another section had a completely different. So what he tries to show here is, indirectly, could it be the case that we all, half of the population, perceive the color red differently than the rest of the population, but somehow we are using the same word? The answer to this question is a definite no from Wittgenstein's part. Here it can be stated really clear. And how can he say that? Well, he can say that because the word and what it is not completely different. They could be said to be on a different scale, but they are not situated in two different hemispheres. They are internally related thanks to the language game. And the simple idea of trying to separate them will lead you into misusing language. And that error is yours and nobody else, because you can still understand language. You have that possibility. But for some reason, you are committing an error. And those errors, I would say, come out of not understanding that language is a potentiality, something implicit. It has determinations, but those determinations are not what we usually perceived as being rules, like paragraphs. When you say this, you must use the word in that direction. I will take a quote from the book here. And this is from the excellent book of David Peat, The Life and Times of David Bohm, called Infinite Potential. And this is an argument relating Krishnamurti, David Bohm, and a bloke called Schumacher. Alfred Korbzinski, another bloke apparently, he said that the word is not the thing. Now, as he spoke with Krishnamurti, Schumacher argued that in a certain sense the word is the thing. Schumacher argued that in a certain sense the word is the thing. Isn't that interesting? Here we have the language argument in a very condensed format. Here you have the message. And when I hear that, my immediate thought is the word thing is part of language. It's not outside language. It's a definite part of language. So how could the word thing have a special purpose outside language? It cannot. And we need to understand this, because otherwise we'll be heading off in the really, really wrong path. And our thoughts processes will be hurt that way. And we ourselves will committing that error. And what he says after that is that words affect thoughts and emotions. They are real things in the world, and they will induce changes in the operation of the brain. But as Schumacher pressed the point, Krishnamurti kept repeating, the word is not the thing. And an emotional pressure built up to such an extent that the dialogue broke down. And I think that goes to say that Krishnamurti had some sort of implicit notion that there was a separation somewhere between the word and what is signified. And I think it's very interesting to speculate that why that would be the case. And I can tell you, I spent some time thinking about these things because I read Krishnamurti at a very young age. And I got hugely affected, and that sort of twisted me in the direction of analytical philosophy, a subject that I followed for, well, at least 2 decades, I think. But this shows the complication of the problem. It's incredibly complicated in one way. It could be pointed as simple as Schumacher did in this case, but it could also be incredibly complicated. I think it has to do with the level of your own understanding. And I think it is, oddly enough, in this case, easier to have a longer explanation, because the longer explanation can turn you into the right thinking mode. And I think Wittgenstein would have said it's not needed, but it's helpful. It helps us. So what's in the case of Krishnamurti? He is from a different language culture. He is from India. So how come that he have this implicit notion that there is a separation between word and a thing? That's not normal from India. Has he reached some further conclusions about the world? Did he have a spiritual awakening at some stage? Something that he claims himself, and that I was led into believing. Oddly enough, a bit similar to the awakening that Wittgenstein said he had. Although the Wittgensteinian awakening took a long time and took a great effort, the Krishnamurti awakening, that was something that happened during a week. I think it needs to be taken in consideration that Krishnamurti at a very young age were exposed to Western influence. And this was so early that he still hadn't formed a complete adult implicit awareness of his own culture. Or maybe he was so perceptive he could suck up the new implicit knowledge. But I think he was only 10 or 11 when he first met Western people. It could be safe to assume that the influence before that was almost zero, because he was coming from the countryside, and I don't believe it was much influence there. But oddly enough, when he came to England, he immediately caught the attention of famous analytical philosophers, and the stream, the current, the implicit current, the zeitgeist in London at that time, it was without a doubt classical physics, analytical philosophy, and that stream. And he later became good friends with names like Aldous Huxley and the whole circle around Aldous Huxley, and he was very much into analytical philosophy. And one of those blokes that definitely felt there was a difference between a word and its meaning. Heck, without that, there is no analytical philosophy to speak of. And I think he also met Krishnamurti ultimately. That's another interesting complication. Krishnamurti met people who were influenced by the zeitgeist, the implicit knowledge in England, but they were trying to convince themselves, because we also have this. We have what Richard E. Lynn called the reflective consciousness. And the reflective consciousness is an automatic process that doesn't really have a proper awareness. And that could actually create things that seems to be real. For instance, we mentioned earlier, it creates objects, it creates sort of a dummy self, a proxy for the real self. These things are all situated in the head, and we also started to point to the head with this head consciousness instead of doing like this to show this is me. And this head consciousness does have its things it wants to do. And one of those things were definitely coming from a chap called Leadbeater, who was in contact with Krishnamurti. He tried to convince himself, or his reflective consciousness, that there was something more to the world than the analytical philosophers said. Because we human beings, we have an internal need to have meaning. And then, first you have the implicit knowledge that everything is more or less materialistic, and there is a difference between word and subject, word and matter, subject and object, and all those things. And then you try to convince yourself, the reflective consciousness, despite what your body feels, try to convince yourself. And I think these things convinced Krishnamurti that the implicit knowledge was right, because he noticed, and this is actually written down, that many of those people engaging in Krishnamurti's future and his position, he was pointed out to be the new Messiah in the Theosophical Society. He noticed that these people weren't implicitly honest, that they were, what he said a couple of months ago, intellectual dishonesty. And for this young chap, who was very, very perceptive, there's no doubt about that, he noticed that, and he took that as a token. The implicit knowledge must be right, the zeitgeist must be right, because that is something they all shared. Whereas the reflective consciousness, it sounded different, and it doesn't really ring true to a perceptive person. You can hear, it sounds, you're trying to convince yourself. You don't really believe in these things. Or, as the subjective reflective consciousness is tainting reality in a way, because it sees in its perspective whatever it wants to see, and it says whatever it wants to see, but it never rings completely true. It's not body, it's not embodied, and it's not hard for a person that's perceptive to sort of feel that. And I think that affected Krishnamurti during the late 1910s after the First World War. So, and this is a very interesting story. Finally, there was a huge conglomeration of people gathered in Holland to point him officially out as the new Messiah. The incarnation of Buddha and Krishna and all those things. And he was supposed to say, I acknowledge that, in front of all the people. And there was a huge group of people gathered in Holland at the big estate. The figures varies, but it was at least a couple of thousands, could have been more. And they came there from all parts of the world. And here comes the surprise. When Krishnamurti rises to the podium, instead of taking the title as the new Messiah, he says, I won't take it. There's no such a thing as a Messiah. Actually, there's no such a thing as a God. And you can imagine what an uproar that created. And when I read this, that hugely affected me. I said, he must have seen the truth, because giving up his whole career as a Messiah and all the opportunities that meant, and also the thing of believing you to be the Messiah, must have been a great encouragement for the young chap. But instead, he decided bravely to step aside from this and leave the whole Theosophical Society, more or less, and all the money and all the glory, which he actually did. That's what's happened. But I think there is a deeper reason. We need to look underneath the surface. And I think what this story tells us, we are really lost in a way if we don't understand the private language argument. Because if we start believing only in the explicit and not seeing what something is meant in the context, in the whole perspective, in the language game, including the world, because this is the important. Because if you start thinking there is a separation between world and words, between words and objects, one part of everything you will more or less ignore, and you will focus on the other one. It's a marginalization going on here. And if you shut one part of the world off, how can you understand the world? You have already taken a stance not to accept the world, because this is an unlawful limitation. And actually, and this is brilliant from the side of Wittgenstein, his objection is not that you cannot make a division. The objection is even stronger. If you would to make a division, where would you put it? You can never have a rule for that. It's impossible. Because that rule had to be outside language. And everybody carefully reading the language argument will understand that's impossible. That has to be inside the language to have an effect. Nothing can have an effect that's outside the language game. It has to be inside. And that's yet another way of expression the private language argument. And obviously Krishnamurti didn't understand that. But in next lecture I will take up maybe some of the reasons why David Bohm didn't understand that. And also what could have happened if David Bohm was to have understood it. That's also a very interesting subject for a lecture, I'll gather. But here you see, those things can be extremely tricky, and it could be covered into cover, because this covering is what the reflective consciousness does. It creates new stuff all the time. And this seems to be on the outside, like a babushka. So you don't get to the inside. And the reason it doesn't get into the inside is the confusion of the private language. You believe in a private language, that sort of hides the meaning. It's like blocking out a part of reality. And for every time you do that, you create another layer. And it's necessary to penetrate each layer to go to the core, so to speak. Or I heard this, maybe this is a better way of putting it. It's not going to the core, it's opening up the babushka, making it transparent so you can see all the way through. And the meaning is not hidden in the inside, it's the seeing through the whole of the layers, how everything came to be constructed. And possibly you can call that an explicit way of reaching knowledge, and therefore opening up for the implicit. So it can sound like a roundabout way to go, but I think that's the turn to go, because it's destined to take you to the right position. Follow my instructions, more or less. This is what Wittgenstein said. And it's like I'm going to show you the way out of the bottle, like showing a fly out of a bottle. And isn't that great? So I think this is a good point to terminate, maybe with a little panoramic view of the very, very nice surroundings we have here.
Thank you.